good to have you back in the rig right here as we continue our trek down the road. Dr. Thomas Ambrosio, we've had him on before. He is an expert when it comes to what's happening in Ukraine and when it comes to a perspective of how the war is going. Let's bring him in. Dr. Ambrosio from NDSU. If I don't say that, the Bison, the herd folks are going to get mad at me. So
that's
there,
right.
I got that covered. Good to have you coming down the road with us.
Yeah, glad to be here again.
Want to talk and get an update from you on how you feel that the war in Ukraine is going?
Well, I actually will take a step back, maybe. Finland is going to be, and Sweden are submitting their applications to join NATO. So if we think about this in the kind of macro geopolitical sense, Russia invaded Ukraine to stop NATO from expanding, and they're going to get a bigger NATO. And the land border between Russia and NATO is going to increase by over, but basically more than double. So that's certainly not good from Russia's perspective. The Russians now are making minor gains in some areas. So in the east, they're making some gains, but they're being pushed back in other areas. So what we're seeing here is probably a war grinding on. There is declining interest in trying to get a ceasefire or a peace deal. The language that's being used by the West and by Ukraine is increasingly they've always been framing this in terms of good and evil, but now it's to the point where they're saying we cannot negotiate with Russia as long as Putin's in office. And it's unlikely he's going to be leaving office, certainly willingly in the near future. So that's a problem because this war is just simply going to continue moving forward.
Well, you know my theory on Putin. We've talked about it many times. I don't think he's a well man. I think that the sheer look of him and everything that I've ever seen in my 60 years here on God's earth tell me that he's not a well man, that he's someone who's sick and is striking while he thinks he can. But that's a theory from afar, from down in Manitoba, North Dakota country. Want to talk to you a little bit about the goal that Putin had, which is, the big burr under the saddle was the potential of Ukraine joining NATO. And you and I both know that Finland has never been jumping up and down to get into anyone's conflict. And now to find them joining NATO, everything that Putin really was working to get out of this war seems to have paid even a larger price in another area.
Right. Sweden has been historically neutral. Finland, of course, they sided with the Axis during World War II, but afterwards they had strict neutrality. They did both join the European Union, but militarily they were close to NATO without becoming members of NATO. But what's happened is there's been a fundamental shift in the way these countries see European security and their own security. And given what Russia did by invading Ukraine, they're saying, no, this is one of these kind of inflection points or crisis points that a political or geopolitical culture can radically flip on its head. In terms of geography, it makes Russia in pretty difficult straits. It also, in essence, makes the Baltic states a NATO lake. You have some Russian connection to the Baltic. You also have Kaliningrad, which is part of Russia, detached physically from Russia, but still on the coast. But strategically, that really just closes off the Baltics to Russia in case there's ever a conflict.
Describe that. Not everybody grabs the globe or grabs the map and takes a real serious look at the Baltic states and says, okay, what does this mean? What price does Russia pay for losing the Baltic states, for losing the water? Describe to people, in kind of that 100 class level, why that is so important.
Well, I mean, geography is in many ways destiny, especially when it comes to military force. And the Baltic Sea is very much a key choke point in Europe. If someone's able to have control over that area, it essentially will prevent Russia or any of those countries from getting out to the Atlantic, in essence, essentially breaking out of that choke point. But with Sweden and Finland going to join, there may be some countries that are going to say, oh, we may veto it, but they eventually will join. That's going to be almost impossible for Russia to break out, because now NATO's force projection, which already, the Baltic's not a very large area, but there were still kind of cracks in that, that could be exploited by Russia. Now that would be simply sealed off. That NATO will be able to project force relatively easily throughout the entire Baltic Sea, which basically means that port is, in case of a conflict, is closed to Russia. That means how does Russia get out? You got to go up through the Arctic. You can't get through the Black Sea because Turkey won't let them go through the Bosporus. So they're more landlocked now than they ever were before.
Well, and I want to talk about that for just a second, because there's a lot of people who are talking about the fact that Ukraine is fighting a proxy war, that everybody's getting the benefit of it in terms of the U.S. in particular, that, funding this war and funding the Ukrainian people is good for the U.S., and we don't even have to send soldiers there to die. Now, that being said, if Finland joins NATO, which it's pretty clear they're going to, how big of a risk does that open up for NATO? Everybody looks at the price that Russia is going to pay for what I think is a huge strategic mistake in opening up and debating, because I don't think Ukraine was ever going to be a member of NATO. I think that NATO countries thought, look, this is a pretty heavy price we're going to pay by bringing them in to NATO. But if Finland joins NATO now, there's a heck of a risk there by NATO as well, isn't there?
I think probably less. The Russians have said they're going to take some kind of direct action, but the reality is that signpost outside on the border now of Finland, which will say this area protected by NATO, is going to be the same as when the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia joined. Those countries actually are in a much more precarious situation in terms they're impossible to defend, whereas Finland's actually much more possible to defend. But it creates some more vulnerability, but it's probably, in terms of the strategic balance of power, is worth it. Certainly far more worth it even than the Baltic states. So I don't think there's a huge risk for us. It's probably good when all is said and done for the United States and for NATO and for the West. But what it does is it intensifies and crosses certain lines for Russia that's going to be hard for us to walk back, or for even them to walk back from.
Right.
So in terms of like just pure military, it's a plus. In terms of being able to move on from this, and all wars end, everything ends, and we have to think about the peace afterward. And we're not thinking about that anymore. Now it's just the war, almost for war's sake.
Okay, so let me put it in more simple terms, which isn't fair to the Ukrainian people, the people of Ukraine to do. If you were NATO and you could have one of these countries, because NATO doesn't like Russia, they never have liked Russia. If you were NATO and one of these countries could or would be a member of NATO, which one's more valuable to NATO, Ukraine or Finland?
All things being equal, before the war, well, now we know Ukraine, but no one thought that would be the case, actually, because everyone initially thought Russia would steamroll. Clearly, Ukraine is a better member of NATO, but given that they're willing to fight, whereas I honestly, my hesitancy about NATO in general is that I'm not sure a lot of these European countries actually would fight or would actually do anything substantive if there was an attack on NATO countries. That's always been my concern about NATO. So we know the Finns would fight, we know the Ukrainians would fight, but certainly having Ukraine is going to be sapping Russia's strength. But of course, Ukraine the way Russia is going to react to Finland and Sweden being in NATO is not the same way they're going to react or would have reacted if we brought Ukraine in NATO. They would have gone in far harsher than they have already in Ukraine, because that is seen as not just a strategic risk and a military risk, but it's also part of Russia, which I don't think we really understand, at least in the way they see the world.
Yeah. For me personally, my biggest concern about NATO always was the dedication that some of the countries had to NATO vis-a-vis Turkey. And, I haven't always seen that these countries, and I'm not talking about fiscal, I'm talking about the belief, the whole premise of NATO is to stop world war. If you poke one of us in the eye, by God, you poked all of us in the eye. Mm-hmm. And so I always wondered whether or not when it came time to fight, when it came time to say, all right, I'll adhere to and hold up to the agreement I signed with NATO, I always wonder if every country is going to do that. I'm not talking about how hard they fight. I'm talking about whether or not they will fight.
I would actually go even further. Like I believe that most NATO countries wouldn't do anything. They would talk a lot. If Russia had moved right into the Baltic states, and this is me going out on a limb, and who knows, this made a cynical part of my brain working here, but I don't think Germany would lift a finger. I'm not even sure France would lift a finger. I'm not sure most of NATO would lift a finger. NATO is, in some ways, an American charity project. Now, there are some countries who are dedicated to it. It seems like the Dutch really are, the Norwegians, the Brits, but I honestly don't think it's mostly the United States extending its security than it is a real alliance. Yeah. It's not an alliance. It is a vehicle for America to extend its security into Europe, and for those countries to extract security from us. We think of security as a resource.
Yeah. Dr. Ambrosio, love these conversations. I'm sure we'll have more because you're foolish enough to answer when we call. So we'll do it again. How's that?
Great. Sounds good. All right. Take care.